Okay, I think I don't see anything, but we are, I think, ready to get started. So a huge thank you to you all for coming, and we're really, really excited to have Akshay Mangla here, who's written this super interesting new book about making bureaucracy work. I see lots of students here, so it's a really apropos also topic this week. You studied bureaucratic norms and the politics of policymaking. So it's a really nice mix, I think, of taking what you've learned and hearing what some of the latest and greatest research says on this. And we're also really honored to have Clare, who's a professor here at the Blavatnik School, an economist, and next to me, Jane Gingrich, who's a professor of social policy here at Oxford. And they're both experts on education. So everybody here is an expert in education, and I'm just an interloper. So I'm not going to tell you about their biographies because you can really easily go online and find out about them. So I think we were just going to dig right into the content. We'll sort of spend the first 20 to 30 minutes talking amongst ourselves, and then open it up to questions from you. So be thinking about what questions you want to pose to Akshay. So I'm going to kick us off by just asking Akshay if you can tell us a little bit about what motivated you to write a book about bureaucracy. So a lot of us would think of bureaucracy in sort of pejorative terms. So tell us, why bureaucracy?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Maya, and thank you, the other panelists, for being here and the audience. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So bureaucracy doesn't invite praise, typically, right? When we say, oh, bureaucracy, we're probably referring to a problem, something that we're unable to get past. And interestingly, as I was studying education, and perhaps taking a step back, why study education? There's quite a lot written about education and its connection to human development. There's a robust literature on differences across countries and levels of education spending. And as I was trying to look at research on India in particular, it struck me that actually in the comparative politics literature, education is not really up there in terms of topics people are studying, and which is an interesting question in and of itself. Why is that, given that we know education is so central to development, and we also know that education is central to actually the growth of politics and political incorporation. So I think the first motivation was to study this phenomenon of mass education. And then why bureaucracy? Well, as I started to dig into the implementation, and that's really the core of the book, is to study why and how is it that policies get implemented, I kept running up against bureaucracy. Citizens would share their experiences with the state, and one couldn't ignore that. And as I delved further into the bureaucracy, I realized that bureaucrats are behaving in ways that the literature just doesn't predict. And so that to me was just a puzzle. Why is it that in some cases you have bureaucrats behaving in ways that actually generate much more effective policy implementation, notwithstanding very similar formal structures and incentives within the state? And so that's really the kind of starting motivation for the book, is to understand that variation and that puzzle in behavior.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to do the danger thing of trying to summarize your argument. And you tell me if I'm correct. So I understand the key argument of the book to be that bureaucracy works best. That is, it works not just for the elites, but for the least advantaged when you get these deliberative norms emerging among bureaucrats. And that's different from legalistic norms. And it works best because it sets into place downstream patterns of engagement with citizens that are virtuous. So once you get these norms, these deliberative norms, good things happen, which makes it really important to understand what a deliberative norm is. So how do I know a deliberative norm when I see it?
Yeah, so maybe taking a step back, why look at norms? There's many other features of bureaucracy you could look at. And norms, as I study them in the book, are unwritten rules. So there's a lot that you can take away from how bureaucracy operates by what's written. But when you go inside an organization, there's an unwritten, unspoken set of, you could say, norms or rules that guide how bureaucrats understand their duties. And that's as a first step in the argument, is that norms are something that exist in organizations. They're the glue and grease as sociologists refer to it in organizations. Now, deliberation is a process of actually organizing around solving problems. So it's a problem orientation, and deliberation at its heart is about discussion. In classrooms, we discuss questions and we try to arrive at better understandings. And in organizations where you have these kind of spaces for actors to deliberate, you have opportunities to actually get diverse viewpoints. So that's one thing. It's not just between the state and society, but within the state itself, that we see that, at least in the Indian case, a huge divide between frontline or street level bureaucrats and senior elite civil servants in the Indian administrative service. But when you have opportunities to discuss and to even formulate what problems are in the first place, you're able to find solutions to them that are much more responsive to local needs. So that's really the core of the argument about how deliberation does that. And the societal input is there as a kind of second step or a second mechanism that actually for education, you also need societal input as much as you need the state to deliver the programs. You need society to co-produce education policies. And deliberation, again, allows society an inlet, an inclusive platform to kind of shape policy implementation.
Okay. Yeah. Last question for me before I turn it over to Jane. And that is about where these norms come from. So you say, great, if you get these deliberative norms, good things happen downstream because they shape engagement, they get diverse viewpoints fed into the process of policy making. And then you get these legalistic, an ideal type which is legalistic. So the point that is really important then for us as policymakers in the room to understand is, where do these norms come from?
Yeah.
How do you get those good norms?
Great. So maybe I'll slightly diverge from your interpretation, and that I don't think all good things happen under deliberation. And in fact, legalism, which is about rule-based and compliance-based orientation, is actually quite an achievement, particularly in a lot of developing countries where states are clientelistic, they're responding to personal demands rather than rules. So I don't want to suggest that all the good sits with deliberation. In fact, there could be downsides in that you might be less, might take more time to come up with a decision because you're deliberating over a period of time. So let me put that aside. Legalistic agencies also achieve some results, as the book shows. They're good at building schools, for instance, and increasing enrollments, but very bad at complex tasks. So I think that's really the difference between them. Where they come from. Now, this is a monumental question for social science. Where do norms come from? And I don't think I have a good theoretical answer. I have to look at the concrete histories of state formation. And I think that's really important, that the moments where state elites have to shape the rules, the relationship that emerges between politicians and bureaucrats really matters. And when that relationship is cooperative, so when you have to work together, you're more likely to get deliberation. By contrast, when you're competing, so when bureaucrats and politicians see themselves at odds with each other, they're more likely to defer to rules as a way to protect their own authority. So that's really the difference in terms of the development. I don't think there's a policy that can come out of that you can just say, this is how you get deliberation, or that's how you get more rule compliance. Yeah.
Jane, over to you.
Great. So Maya asked us to sort of put together a few reactions and then move into kind of a question period. So I just want to start by really drawing out what I see as a number of the core contributions of this absolutely fantastic book. So for those of us that sort of think about education, we'll start sort of thinking about education looking at questions of performance at an aggregate level. And I should say my background really is in studying education systems in OECD countries. And so that's sort of my starting point is when you look at if you just go and look at PISA, for instance, the test for achievement test for 15-year-olds that probably most people in here are familiar with, when you look at those top performers, the group at the top, it's kind of a puzzling set from a lot of our theories in political science and social policy. So you have Singapore, Estonia, Japan, Canada, and within Canada, some provinces do better than others. My home province of Saskatchewan is not one of them, but others are, our next door neighbor, Alberta, is a high performer, Taipei, and so on. And when you're coming from a kind of a welfare perspective or comparative social policy perspective like me, it's puzzling to some extent to look at that grouping of countries because you have big welfare states, small welfare states, you have more liberal labor markets, more coordinated labor markets, and so on. So how do we understand that? And I think when we look at it, we realize that, there's not a single set of policies. There's not one intervention that's driving these. There's not one set of inputs that we can point to, more spending, less spending, higher levels of testing, lower levels of testing. That there's something about the configurations of the way these institutions come together, and particularly the ability of the state to actually drive through systems of high performance. And so if that's the case, then we need to understand sort of why did Finland and Estonia and Canada and Japan and Singapore develop sets of institutions that really work together to promote high levels of performance, whereas other countries have struggled. And I think Akshay's book gives us a way of thinking about that is really very profound. So in the theoretical chapter of the book, what he does is this beautiful visual where he sort of disaggregates aspects of the education process by the degree of complexity. And he says, look, there's things that are codifiable, the measurable things. And actually, bureaucracies that are more legalistic are pretty good at that. They know how to build schools or count test scores or things like that. But when we think about what actually drives performance in education, which is a much more complex form of co-production that's linked, in which citizens, parents, children, teachers, and the state are all linked together, that those are systems that require thinking about beyond just these sort of procedures that are easy to codify. So then the puzzle becomes, how do we create institutions that systematically produce these high-performing, hard-to-codify outcomes? And the answer relies for him on the way in which the bureaucracy itself functions. And so to understand that then, he takes a step back and says, look, bureaucracies in education are almost necessarily multi-level. Now, they're particularly multi-level in a context like India that is actually federal and huge, and you need to have lots of interacting parts. But even in unitary states, you're going to have a multi-level system because the actors that are really delivering education to kids are on the ground. There are teachers in classrooms with 30 or 20 kids in front of them all day, and they're embedded in schools, and schools are embedded in local governments, and local governments are embedded in a system that is usually governed by some higher level unit. So we need to understand the incentives in this multi-level setting in which they're sort of moving back and forward from the sort of frontline people to the actors within the state that are providing them with resources and providing them with, I think, a systematizing of the norms in which they're operating. And then we also need to understand how they're interacting with people on the ground, like parents and kids. And so in developing this concept of a deliberative bureaucracy, he is sort of embedding these frontline workers within a system in which norms are enforced by higher level units, but they're also enacted on the ground and have these feedbacks with parents. And I think that this way of conceptualizing it is really enlightening for thinking about both how do we theorize this multi-level system and also theorize the things in this multi-level system that will really matter. The third sort of thing about the book, that on top of sort of setting out the puzzle in education and really theorizing the bureaucracy in education in these really new and novel ways, is just that the book is an empirical powerhouse. It's just the amount, 507, I think, interviews, years of field work, really working through all actors in the system, talking to parents, talking to teachers, talking to higher level bureaucrats. It gives a picture that I think is really rare for us to have this sort of full sort of 360 view of what's actually happening in education and to follow it through in multiple sites over time. And so from all sort of angles, in terms of the theoretical richness and the empirical foundation, the book really is doing something I think that is very special in the field of education research. So I have a few, not critiques, but things I want to push on in my remaining few minutes before turning it back over to Clare and Akshay. So the first is I want to sort of pull apart this concept of deliberation a little bit more. I think there's actually 4 underlying sub-concepts that I couldn't always get my head around how they were sort of linking together. So on the one hand, I think there is a part from the perspective of the bureaucracy that involves both the degree of discretion and the degree of autonomy of the actors. And so the book makes a strong sort of builds on this distinction between discretion versus rules, but takes the discretionary side and pairs it with the deliberative side. And I don't think that that's necessarily always the case. So discretion doesn't always pair with autonomy, and nor does discretion always pair with deliberation. And equally, the concept of deliberation, I think, has two sub-concepts, one about participation and one about inclusion. And so if we think about discretion initially, one could say, if we're looking at, say, police violence in the US, that when we see a police officer engage in sort of brutal violence on the street, that they're exercising some degree of discretion. They're interpreting rules in a way, but it's a way that looks almost the polar opposite of the sort of the model here, in that it's meant to be punitive rather than inclusive. So discretion in and of itself, clearly, and the book doesn't make this claim at all, isn't necessarily deliberative, but equally deliberation isn't necessarily inclusive. So again, to use the example, say for instance, of coming from the American education literature, we know that school board or discussions of local democracy around schools are often racially exclusionary in the US. And in fact, there's work that shows that the things that have pushed more sort of racial integration in local school districts, like busing, actually were more successful when local bureaucrats took a step back from local deliberative processes. And in fact, local deliberative processes often can produce things that look like racial exclusion. So it seems like what works together in this case is when you have a mix of a somewhat autonomous bureaucracy that is able to exert some discretion, that is also participatory, but has a vision of participation that is inclusive, particularly towards minorities that might be excluded. And one of the things I kept wondering is, like, when those things mix and match in a way where all four don't come together, what kinds of outcomes do we get? So we could imagine situations in which one had exclusionary participation, in which one had some degree of discretion that was non-participatory, and that we could see outcomes that don't look as sort of virtuous in the cycle that's promoted here. The second question that came from that then is, there's this nice discussion in the conclusion about the way in which inequality intersects with forms of deliberative bureaucracies, and in fact, the outcomes in which one might anticipate sort of more high levels of performance within the public sector versus in some cases where legalism combines with inequality actually argues that it can lead to demand for the private sector. But again, I wondered about the kind of scope of the deliberative bureaucracy as a cause, or something that sort of causes something, versus the outcomes that it's meant to promote, because these feedback loops are often complex, and in which one could imagine some degree of deliberative processes that do lead to sort of a backlash from groups that lead to the outcomes that are associated with legalism. And it wasn't clear to me if that was something that was embedded in the concept itself, or in which you really were making sort of claims about a link that would move from bureaucratic structures to particular patterns of behavior on the ground. And the third kind of thing I'd want to push a little bit more on is this sort of preconditions for a degree of participatory inclusion. So particularly in the case in the book, much attention is paid to the role of gender, and I really like the way in which sort of the role of women as actors on the ground, as parents, becomes very important in this sort of feedback loop between the sort of practices and the state. And yet, in a way, one of the arguments is that some of the institutions, and I'll probably say this wrong, the Mahalia Samarkya. Did I just butcher that entirely?
You can call it MSUP.
Okay, MSUP.
Yeah.
There's institutions around the side that are promoting gender-based participation of women, and giving resources that are allowing the inclusion, particularly of women from disadvantaged background in politics, that are working alongside these bureaucratic norms. And that seems like a possibility, I think, for potentially more change over time than these sort of long-standing state-building processes that are really built in sort of formative experiences of the bureaucracy. So I want to hear a little bit more about that. Thank you.
That was so rich that actually, I think before we move to Clare, do you want to
Yeah.
have a moment to respond to some of
well,
these?
this requires a lot more than a moment. So thank you so much for that very careful reading of the book and very generous set of comments. I guess 2 points I suppose I'll just want to flag. One is that I distinguish deliberation from discretion. So I think bureaucrats have discretion irregardless of the particular sets of norms that might operate in a bureaucracy. A cop can pull you over. The question is, what is the guiding norm over the use of that discretion? And I think that is what varies. And I think it could be that in a deliberative bureaucracy, the space to modify rules in response to needs is broader. You can read that as more discretion, but I'd rather see that as a different use of discretion. In a legalistic case, you can actually pull someone over and then respond and refer to the rules, or not pull someone over and refer to the rules. So you have just as much discretion. The reasons, the rationale you would give for your behavior, and perhaps the scope of what you see is, what you ought to do will be different in the two cases. So I think that is the key difference between the two. Now, why is deliberation inclusive? It need not be. I think it's absolutely right that you can have deliberative spaces that get co-opted, that get captured by elites. And very much you see that happening in Gram Sabhas, which are these deliberative spaces in India's local governments at the village level. I think the kind of difference I observe, at least in my cases, is that when bureaucrats encourage participation, and that's the first step before inclusion, encourage participation, they're subject to a diversity of views that they were not subject to before. And they're more open and more willing to hear from a broader set of actors as a consequence. So I'll just give an example where state officials that brought in, for example, district officials into discussions around planning meetings were actually then, as a consequence, more keen to hear from even more local level actors at the block level or at the school level. And in some sense, that notion of participation opened up the space for more inclusion. Now, it doesn't have to do that. And it could be something particular to the history of how deliberation developed within the states I look at. And you mentioned Mahila Samakhya, and I'll end with this response. Mahila Samakhya is an intervention for women's empowerment. So there's a very particular purpose to deliberation that's happening here, which is to combat patriarchal norms in society and within the state itself. And actually, in that case, it's a pocket of deliberation within a legalistic bureaucracy. So there's an effort at institutional change, which is still unfinished. So it's not a complete change, but there's a pocket of change. And the one way I see that one indicator is conflict. You see a lot of conflict between bureaucrats and between the state and society as you're trying to encourage deliberation. So I think those would be like some ways in which deliberation may not be always ideal in some sense, but in another way opens up spaces for more and broader set of voices, particularly those who are traditionally kept out of conversations. Yeah.
Great, over to you, Claire.
Okay, so first I'd like to thank Maya for inviting me, because this has given me an opportunity, a reason and a deadline to sit down with a book which is incredibly closely aligned to my research area, and yet we had never actually interacted before, so that's great. I'm going to give a big picture kind of reaction and then a couple of questions. So I thought the overarching question as to why this variation in the delivery of primary schooling was important and interesting. And you emphasised in the introduction that the answer could lie in terms of policy adoption, that policies could differ across geographies, or it could be in the policy implementation. And this really resonated, this distinction between adoption and implementation. And it's part of the RISE programme, which I think you're familiar with, the way in which we've structured our political economy teams. But it's also the starting point for one of the research programmes I've been working on under DeliverEd, which is where we're actually trying to study implementation of education policies. And I think it has been understudied in education politics, as you say, but I think it's been understudied in education throughout the social sciences. It's true in the economics of education, it's true in the sociology of education. I think implementation has been missing, so it's not just a feature of education politics. And I've been thinking I've been attempting to think carefully about it for a few years now, but something I hadn't focused on within the DeliverEd programme is this idea of co-production. And I thought that was a really novel angle and really was interesting to me because I hadn't really thought about that before. And it's clearly so central to education because it is co-produced with parents and pupils. So my first question is kind of around that co-production idea, and it's about the empirical part of the book. And you point to the functioning of the diversity in the functioning of the bureaucracy, and the fact that, as Lance Pritchett would have said, that the Indian state is flailing, but it's not flailing everywhere, right? There are pockets of excellence. And that very much resonates with what I've been finding in my research in Ghana, where we've been studying the mid-level of the education bureaucracy, and we see pockets of excellence. And I'm going to come back to what exactly we measure in Ghana later. And you hypothesize that it's deliberative norms that may be behind this variation in delivery and in implementation. And it's because of the possibility to adapt to policy and to raise community buy-in. And when I started reading about that fascinated me, because at least in the economics literature that I'm familiar with, and in particular with RCTs, there hasn't been that much success in terms of policies that are about trying to get community buy-in. School management committees typically don't yield positive results in terms of driving student learning. So could you tell us a little bit more about the evidence that you find to support this idea of the communities really making the difference? You contrast, I'm not going to try and mangle the Indian, but you contrast HP and UP, and you say it's about the community buy-in. What exactly is it? And what could we take from that? What lessons can we take? It's not a school management committee, RCT, but what is it that's potentially transferable to other settings that could get that community engagement to work? So the sort of policy question there. Shall I carry on with my other questions, or do you want
I think so. Yeah, I think lay them all out there.
So that's kind of my first question. My second question is around how we should think about norms. And maybe I'm going to say this because I'm an economist, not a political scientist, and I know you guys have been studying norms this week, but you contrast these deliberative versus legalistic norms, and this all echoed a dichotomy that I've come across in the reading for Deliveroo, which is around delivery approaches. And in our work, sort of looking at what delivery approaches are, we came across two ideal types as well. So what delivery approaches are they're a set of management functions intended to try and improve how bureaucracies work. And we saw that there could be very top-down approaches, all focused on accountability, which is typified by, for instance, delivery approaches in the UK, the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit. But against that, there were delivery approaches that were much more oriented around problem-solving and organisational learning, as typified by the Pemandu Delivery Unit in Malaysia. So, in our conceptual framework, we have these two ideal types. And I started thinking, are we talking about the same thing? Mm-hmm. Right? We were couching this in the language of delivery approaches and management functions and management practices. You're couching it in the language of norms, but are we talking about the same kinds of things? And so my question to you is, what's the difference between a bureaucratic norm and a set of management practices or management routines? Now, if we think about the ways in which, to link it to my work in Ghana, the ways in which a district education director is running their district education office, we went and surveyed them and asked them what they were doing in terms of management practices. But had we asked them about their norms, what would have been different? So it's a question to you, like, how do you think there's a difference there? And why does it matter? Well, I'm under the sense that the management practices are malleable, and you can train on management practices, and indeed people do. Van Reenen and Bloom have tried this, and so forth. And we've seen interventions around trying to train management practices within schools. So if there is this overlap between what bureaucratic norms are and what management practices are, it again gives us scope to think about it in terms of policy. Maybe we can try and take some of these deliberative norms into other places where they're not as prevalent through the training of the management practices of the bureaucrats. So that's my second question to you. And I have a bunch more, but in the interest of time, I'll stop there.
Right. I'll turn it over to you, Akshay, before we get questions from
the group. Again, thank you so much for this close reading and a great set of questions. I guess I'll start with the second question. Why norms and why not just talk about a managerial approach or a set of management practices? And I think well, one is empirically, when I would speak to bureaucrats, as one scratched the surface, it wasn't necessarily that they were trying to follow any particular approach, but they had ideas of what they ought to do. So there's a sense of what it means to be a good bureaucrat, which is much deeper in some sense than a managerial practice. So one, for example, I guess the paradigm example is when the United States tried to adopt the Toyota model of automobile production. That's a set of managerial practices of having lean production and having workers on the assembly line participate in decision-making about how to produce the vehicle, and you get these process innovations on the assembly line. They take that from Japan, bring it into the United States, and lo and behold, they find that it fails. Now, the practices were adopted, they were executed. Actually, when you talk to workers, you talk to managers, their notions of what they ought to be doing were very different from Japanese managers and workers. And part of the reason is that the political economy context in which they worked was very different. Employees in the Japanese factories had a sense of loyalty because they knew that they would not get fired immediately. They had a longer time horizon to their work, so they could take the risks that the practices actually encouraged them to do. And I mean, in short, there was a very different set of norms and trust between managers and workers that you could not just extract and put into a managerial practice blueprint and say, now do this elsewhere. You'd have to recreate the conditions to actually make sense of those practices and embed them in everyday routines. And that's where I think norms matter. And one state in India, Uttarakhand, tried to copy the practices in Himachal Pradesh. So Uttarakhand was formed into a state in 2000, looked at its hilly neighbor, both are based in the Himalayan region, and tried to take this practice of, for example, having women's associations participating in education. When it came down to the local level, frontline officials saw this as an example of patronage and corruption, actually. Why should we be granting societal groups this say over schooling? And in fact, it didn't work, even though it was written into a practice booklet. So I think that's one distinction I would make. And perhaps that also gets to your first question, that there have been attempts using RCTs and other methods to inculcate societal participation. And for one, I think it's a long-term process. And especially when you look at historically disadvantaged groups, to say that in a year or so we're just going to get robust participation, I think is a tall ask, particularly for those who are not used to speaking in public, expressing their voice. And so there, I would say that the cases where I see this work well is that it's an iterative process that took place over time, and it was very incremental. It was by no means this, great bureaucrats came in and said, let's create deliberation, and then in a few years you got it. It was more like a decade, 2 decades for that to happen. And that could be a time horizon issue, and that the studies that one would cite for kind of policy relevance tend to have a shorter time horizon. But also, like for the reason I said to the first question, the things that we're trying to copy, so village education committees in India have been tried and have been studied, and a famous paper shows that they don't work. Well, maybe what doesn't work is how they're implemented. Actually, did you ensure over time that actually the least advantaged had a reason to participate? What time did the meetings take place? Did they conflict with people's work obligations? So I think when you get into the nitty-gritty of implementation, you realize that even with like well-designed programs, actually getting to the fine-tuning of local needs is very difficult, and that could be partially why we don't see such an effect. And maybe it means we have to kind of start at an even smaller level and maybe have a longer time horizon for some of these programs.
Okay, now it's your chance to ask questions, and if you're online, rest assured I can see your questions if you send them in. We have a lot of experience in the room. I know we have a DPhil student who's studying bureaucratic norms and real rigidity. I know we have an Indian bureaucrat in the room. So questions? Yes.
Hello, my name is Shravan. Actually, initially when I read the title of the book, I read it as Making Bureaucrats Work. Yeah, I mean, but that's just something I wanted to share. But given the way how you started the talk about norms, and there's something that you call that unsaid norms, I wish to know more about where do we place or situate the evidence in bureaucratic decisions? Because I'm not talking about policy. Policy is at the later part, but since you talk about unsaid norms, so I'm trying to connect it with the bureaucratic decisions. Maybe you can reflect on your thoughts on I think to what I remember, the book started from the fieldwork of UNICEF in 2008, if that is correct. So, I mean, now the book is out, so just wanted your reflections on where do we place or situate evidence in bureaucratic decisions?
I see, right. Should I just?
Yeah.
Great. So, very important observation. The book says making bureaucracy work, not bureaucrats work. I'm glad you pointed that out because I think one thing I'm trying to do is actually view bureaucrats as being embedded in relationships. And it's not necessarily an individual bureaucrat, but bureaucrats as members of organizations with collective norms, rules, relationships that really matter. Now, where does evidence fit in all of this, right? In a few different places. I mean, for one, what evidence is deemed to be legitimate? And I think that is an important part of the question of evidence-based policy implementation or policy that needs to be discussed is why might bureaucrats reject evidence? Is it because they don't care, or maybe they have different standards for what evidence matters? And what I found, at least from the cases I looked at, is that legalistic bureaucracies are much more suspicious of evidence that's produced outside of their organizations, partly because they're not seen as official. So unofficial sources of evidence or data take, for example, India's annual survey on education. Pratham does it every year. I think it's a brilliant survey, and it's shown us that actually learning outcomes are very poor. When I share that with state bureaucrats in some states, they'll say, well, that's just a sample. Just a sample, even though it's a national sample and a very well-designed sample. Now, let's wait and see what the data tell us from the education department. Now, you can say that's just a way of bureaucrats sidelining evidence, but actually they respond to the evidence that comes out of the department. So one could be your relationship to evidence. I found bureaucrats in the institutions that were more deliberative, willing to rely on evidence that came from a much broader range of sources. And that could just be from the process of having to discuss and debate and take in local level knowledge and information that might not be produced by the governmental agency. So that's perhaps one, it's an orientation towards evidence that might vary. Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah,
I would like to ask, how does India invest in the digital transformation government system to prevent the bureaucracy from corruption?
and there was another question here.
You have a question? Yeah, why you?
Sure, just to add, I'm looking forward to reading the book, and I haven't dived into it yet, but thinking about principal-agent relationships, and you're looking at deliberative processes between bureaucrats and citizens, where do politicians fit in, and sort of how do you see them as being part of that process for education delivery as well?
Great. So maybe the first question. So I don't look at sort of technological interventions to deal with corruption per se. Though interestingly enough, that does come up in one part of the book where I look at the delivery of India's midday meal program. So this is the largest child nutrition program in the world, and there's massive problems of food grains not reaching schools, leakages in the system. And one effort to address that has been to digitize the process of fund flow and procurement of food grains. It's interestingly enough, what at least what I found in the state where I looked at that program, that effort, was that it basically shifted corruption further down the chain, where there was room to kind of circumnavigate that system. And so there was a lot of collusion between, for example, headmasters and the local village head and food grain company. So that does come up, but I didn't look at that as systematically as one might. On this question about politicians, really important. So when I talk about deliberation in the book, it happens at multiple levels. So it's really important to keep this in mind, that it's not just about a frontline deliberation happening in spaces in villages, for example. It's happening inside the state, and that will include members of the Legislative Assembly. So in developing, for example, more adaptive programs, bureaucrats will often look to elected officials who may know their constituencies a lot better. So they're definitely part of deliberation. And then down at the local level, politicians like a head of a panchayat will be part of deliberation as well. So they're part of the discussions. I don't think they have a special role in this. And maybe that's perhaps in some ways distinct from a lot of the political science literature on education where politicians are prominent. I actually find bureaucrats are just as important in kind of setting the platforms. One place I think politicians might face, in the book at least, bureaucrats are kind of pushing against politicians, is that in some instances, politicians are in many ways, taking education policy or taking those elements of education policy that they can control the most, which are school buildings. And bureaucrats are pushing them to do things beyond that. So there's kind of a tension, actually, between bureaucrats and politicians quite often. And one politician told me that, actually, it's not my job to do this implementation work. People come up to me asking me for it, but it's not my job. It's actually the job of the bureaucrat. And so even politicians themselves face this tension internally in the book. Yeah.
Aisha.
Thank you for a wonderful book. I'm doing my PhD in rule behavior bureaucrats, so it's really pertinent to me. My question is about, I think it's a little bit about your research design and how this concept of bureaucratic norms, how perhaps you explained it using historical origins, but also having politics as potentially influencing norms and various other factors. So how did you go about sort of assigning the right degree of sort of influence on how norms changed? Because that's something I'm battling with. Yeah. And then the second question is about discretion and norms. When it came to decision making, how did these sorts of norms affect the level of discretion of bureaucrats?
Right. So how about I take the first question in particular? So the research design tries to actually set out, in a way, this kind of problem, which is that I'm trying to identify the impact of norms. So one is to look subnationally. And so I hold constant formal features of the state. I think that's the starting point of the argument, is that, well, formal bureaucracy in terms of recruitment methods, promotion, pay, civil service protections, the things one normally associates with formal structures are held constant. So that's a starting point. But beyond that, I made a very, you could say, concerted decision not to look at every state in India and not do what I see in a lot of books on human development in India prior, which is to look at north-south divide in India. There's huge variation between the north and south in education and human development outcomes. And you may be familiar with the case of Kerala as a really important example of social development at relatively low income. What I focused on was variation within North India, and the reason for that was I was trying to control for a whole host of other factors. So I looked at two states in the hilly region, which have similar geographies, similar size populations, similar incomes, and importantly, similar socio-cultural norms. And I think that's one of the things that is actually really important for implementation that's really hard to evaluate or to incorporate into a design early on. But for example, female participation in the labor force is an indicator of gender norms. So that was one of the factors that I was taking into consideration in the design. And then ultimately, it's the kind of field-based methods, which for my work have to be multi-level. So I looked at the state, but then also down to the district and the village level, and tried to trace implementation. And at each level, if you go through the book, I know it's a lot to get through. Probably gets lost somewhere. But at each level, I tried to account for alternative explanations, right? So I tried to set up what is the best alternative explanation that could account for some of the differences that I'm seeing or some of the patterns that I'm seeing. And can I find evidence for it? How can I refute it? And that's really the approach I took to that, yeah. On discretion, I think I tried to get at it before, but it very much you see discretion in both types of bureaucracy.
We have a gentleman at the back there.
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting discussion, and I haven't read the book, so apologies. I work mostly in health, which has some parallels, I think. You talk about a lot about the importance of norms, and I've worked on some aspects of that. And the question for us has been, how do you then change them? And so I'm interested in what your thoughts are there, particularly for sort of professional bureaucrats who are sort of in a managerial stream, because I'm interested in your thoughts on how do you do it and how long does it take and whether you can do it from the inside. So maybe I'll just ask you those 3 questions and see what you say.
Probably the hardest question.
Can I just tag on a little bit to that? So I think one of the things that was interesting is at the end of the book, you talk about the comparison between India and China, right? And that's a comparison that looms large in discussions of public policy. And I think one of the things you say is that, these are, on education, these are 2 countries that look very similar for decades, from the time of independence in India and sort of, the time of the cultural, the revolution in China. And something changes in China in the 1980s, right, where it's changing a little bit from within, and that it sounds like it's a top-down promotion of a deliberative norm. So politicians at the political center are telling bureaucrats in regions to engage in this kind of deliberation, which is, I think, is an interesting connection to this question. Is that a case of change from the top?
Great. So yeah, this is the hardest part. How do you get, 2 questions are very hard. Where do norms come from, and then how do you change them? And I think the book has more evidence on persistence than it does on change. So I'll say that from the outset. There's a lot of resistance to change, actually. But I do think there's some mechanisms, and maybe it's partial changes that I observed rather than wholesale changes. But certainly support from the top, having leadership that's committed to change is a necessary step, I find. Not sufficient, but necessary. What's needed alongside that is to actually build commitment on the front lines for change. And that kind of feeds back. And that is a process that takes a lot of time. I mean, the change that I observed in a bureaucracy in India took about 20 years, and it's not complete. And it could be that, the organizations I look at are actually quite resistant to change and don't want it. And so it might be much, much harder in those circumstances. But it really requires that kind of top-down commitment, but and bottom-up. But the key mechanism that I observe is actually managing conflict, because change will require conflict between what was done before or what's happening in a pocket of the bureaucracy, and elsewhere it's not happening. And you need to actually create a platform to actually speak about that conflict, make sense of it, and actually support those who are actually dealing with it on the front lines. And I think that is a process of change. Now in China, I didn't go into the process of explaining how it is that China became or adopted norms of deliberation, but certainly there's a top-down element to that, for sure. I think the interesting thing with China is that while there's a top-down element, China's among the most decentralized countries in terms of public goods provision. So I don't think it's strictly about top-down. In fact, providing maybe it's an incentive to those who are at the bottom to actually participate in problem solving. So one thing that the Chinese party state did was actually encourage experiments and facilitate that, and then support those who were doing them, and those that didn't work, turn them off, and those that are doing well, scale them up. And a big contrast with the Indian state is we have a bureaucrat from India here, but many that I've talked to have told me India is a graveyard of pilots. There's a lot of pilots, a lot of individual initiatives by well-meaning officials, but they don't get scaled up, and so that change doesn't actually percolate through the rest of the bureaucracy. And I think that's probably a big difference between India and China in that platform for local level change to get scaled up.
Yes.
So I found the discussion between discretion and deliberation pretty interesting. And given that I've worked a bit with bureaucrats in rural MP and UP, I saw the bit on deliberative norms further shaping deliberation to be quite effective in the work that I've done as well. What I was seeing this as, and it may not be true, but it was like a dialectic or opposing forces between discretion and deliberation. And I was wondering, since there was mentioning of the political economy context shaping norms, how do you see instances where, say, democracies are moving towards more authoritarian regimes, or otherwise, how do you see the political norms shaping the decision-making of the bureaucrats? And if there's lesser discretion available, does that change or push deliberation in another direction?
Yeah, great question. Not something I looked at as closely in my field work, but certainly a move towards authoritarianism leads to a more centralized decision making, which can make deliberation much kind of more concentrated. As a consequence, it means that there's less participation across the ranks. And that's perhaps one thing I would expect, though. The China case looms large in my mind, that here you have an authoritarian state that in many ways is much more deliberative than the Indian state. And it could be that that elections aren't enough, and you also need robust, association at the local level, and that could be a difference. But it strikes me that a political culture of authoritarianism can push against deliberation. But it may very well be that if that culture also encourages discussion, and there's a rich literature coming out of China on what's called authoritarian deliberation. And I would urge people to read it, because it's not at all that deliberation is exclusively there for democracies. It exists in non-democracies as well. And maybe it is that states develop these spaces as a way to cope with being non-democracies. It might be another way to get information from the local level. That's my reading, at least, of the Chinese political economy literature. In India's case, it's not clear to me that a sort of move towards a more authoritarian form of government at any level, the state level or the national level, would inculcate that kind of deliberation that you see, because it's often about concentrating power upward, right, and limiting decision-making from below. And I think that's probably not going to work in favor of local level participation.
Okay, yes. So because you were mentioning China, I remember the Bureaucracy's work on like solidarity groups, and then how to enforce accountability even without democracy. Like, do you also see differences in the ways citizens in different regions also enforce this informal accountability to the bureaucrats and also to politicians?
Yeah. So just for those who may not be familiar, so Lily Tsai, who I studied under as a graduate student at MIT, so I was lucky to learn from her, looked at the role of temple groups and church groups in rural China and found that they have different effects on the degree of accountability of the local state. And I do think groups matter, and it could be, I found that women's groups played a major role, but there are other groups there. And one, I think, I'm in broad agreement with Lily Tsai's argument, is that encompassing groups actually are more likely to get broad participation rather than those that have sectional interests. And so women's associations actually had to do a lot of work to fight against caste differences, even among their members. And so where you don't have that kind of encompassing group, it's much more fragmented. And for a public good like education, it's harder to get community-wide collective action when you have rival groups or factions fighting against each other. And you do see variation. So in the Hill region, you see women's groups are much more likely to cut across caste and economic lines than in the plains. And as a consequence, I find that collective action is much more episodic in the plains. It happens in short spurts, and then it dissipates, whereas it's much more, you could say, regular and much more, you could say, it follows a process over time that's much more robust in the hills. So that's the variation I see on that.
All right, so it looks, yes.
Yeah, thank you for this talk. I've been very interested in like how we develop sustainable policies that resist changes in leadership, changes in government, because I come from a country which has faced a lot of political coups. And I've worked with government, so I've seen that usually we spend a lot of time developing these strategies, and then once there is a sudden shift, then everything stops. So this talk about having norms and institutionalizing norms is very interesting. But my question is, when you say that there is resistance to change, and then you have populations that are expecting a timely implementation of projects, would you say that to improve the accountability mechanisms, it will be good to institutionalize, citizen participation throughout the process?
Yeah, great question. And I think partly what I observe in states that have legalistic bureaucracies, that have resisted in many ways some participatory reforms, I observe exit to the private sector. I mean, that is the big shift that's happening, and that is happening as leadership changes, you get new bureaucrats, you get new politicians. The public is actually fed up with the low quality of education, and so they're voting with their feet, and that's a broad process that's taking place. I do think there's something to attempts to institutionalize citizen participation. My worry is that, and I guess this is based on my experiences, particularly in Uttar Pradesh, which is India's largest state and has tried to do this, is that bureaucrats end up seeing it as another compliance-based indicator. So have I created community groups, for example? And so they tend to treat these policy interventions as yet another part of the checklist of things that they have to do, rather than the more challenging and you could say nebulous work of how do I even form a committee? How do I even ensure participation? And so that's my one concern with that. But maybe a way around that is to actually begin far more locally, find individuals who actually might be positive deviants, might be challenging norms, and support them to experiment with these interventions at a local level to at least show other bureaucrats that this can be done. And that's just a hypothesis, and I would love for policy people to come up with more ideas. Is how do you get a good idea that's in a pocket of a state to actually expand to other parts of the state? And that's, to me, one of the hardest questions, actually. And that gets to this question of scaling up policy reform. And I think we know a lot about maybe certain policies that work, less so about how do you scale them up and how do you get governance to work around those particular policies. And I think that's really the challenge.
All right, so I'm going to take moderator's privilege and ask just one closing question as is appropriate in a policy school, which is you're in a room full of people who may not all be in the realm of education, but they all want to go out and reform policy in some way. So what is the one thing they should take away from your book that they should keep in mind when they are thinking about policy reform?
Right. Well, maybe the one thing I would say is that, bureaucracy isn't just one thing. And I think that is, it seems rather obvious to say that. But when you think about the agencies that are implementing public policy, recognize that while they may look the same, they may have similar appearances from the outside, inside they can operate very differently. And that means having a degree of empathy for those officials that you see that might be resistant or might not understand or appreciate your kind of enthusiasm for a particular policy reform, and place yourself in their shoes for a moment and try to imagine what it could be that is encouraging them or discouraging them from having the same enthusiasm that you have. And it could be that someone else in that bureaucracy has that enthusiasm or a different agency has it. But to kind of see the bureaucrat and the bureaucracy is not just kind of a uniform monolithic entity, but actually the varieties of bureaucracy out there. And I've encapsulated 2 in my book, but there's probably many more. And so I'd be open to you as kind of students of public policy to help us identify better working bureaucracies in other settings too.
So a huge thank you, Akshay, for coming and sharing this book with us. It's, to paraphrase Jane, an empirical juggernaut, and I think we'll be all parsing through it for quite a while to come. And of course to Jane and to Clare for reading so carefully and I think providing you with some rich food for thought. So please join me in thanking.